Hey everyone, welcome to the final week of nuk218, Introduction to 3D Animation for Compositors. In this session, we're going to wrap up with a few gags that are just generally helpful. The main one we're going to look at is actually changing the perspective of a shot, and we'll cover that in a moment. What I wanted to start out with is a very simple but very useful reason for using a 3D camera tracker that isn't obvious. Usually we use camera trackers, at least we think of using them for things like adding 3D models into a scene, for composites, for doing clean plating, those kinds of things. But actually they're really useful for screen inserts and things like that. So here we have a screen that we're going to look at replacing, and typically you would throw something like this in a Mocha. And actually Mocha would probably just be able to track this, but I'll frequently get shots where in certain frames the entire image is covered up, the entire screen surface is covered up, so there's nothing for Mocha to track. And in those cases you're going to end up in a real trouble. But with a 3D tracker we can actually continue to track as long as we have other objects in the background. This shot isn't a great example of that because there aren't actual background features. But in general, it's a really powerful technique when a Mocha sort of track won't work. And Mocha may actually have some trouble with this just given how much of the screen is obscured. But you'll frequently get someone in the foreground walking and completely obscuring for a frame or two the entire screen. And so this technique I'm about to show you is a real quick and easy way of nailing down a screen replace. So let's take a look. First thing we're going to do is track this. So we need to garbage out anything that's not going to be a reliable track, and pretty much all of these people are going to be unreliable as a track source because they're all moving to some degree. At least we can't trust them to be perfect statues. So we have enough screen here that we can track that and solve the camera. So I'm going to add Rotopaint, and I'll start at frame 1. Let me just show you, I don't know if we've done this yet, the basic process for garbage matting for camera tracking is you want to be real quick. If it takes more than about 10 minutes for a shot like this, then you're spending way too much time being precise. So there's my first track. I'm going to hit Shift right arrow, right cursor arrow to jump 10 frames from there. And I'm just going to move this into place. Come down, pull this out, and just quickly massage the shot like so. And I'll just pop this out here, hit the Z key to change this to Bezier handles. Shift right arrow to move to the next frame, grab some points, move them over, readjust. And I'll select this, hit the Z key again to flip. And that'll do it for that frame. Shift right arrow to jump ahead again. Move this whole shape over. Make fine-tuning adjustments, etc., etc. I'll go ahead and finish that off. By the way, one thing that'll often happen, I'll just show you this here. If you start to try to move all these points up together, you'll often get their Bezier handles all messed up, and you get all kind of a weird shape. Quick, easy fix for that is to drag select through all the points and hit the Z key, which turns cusp points into smooth points, but it also realigns the tangents of smooth points. So that's a nice little tip if you ever just want to quickly bunch up a bunch of points but are having issues with the handles being all over the place. Alright, I'm going to pause this and come back with a finished garbage mat because this is not a tedious roto class here, thankfully. Okay, so let's go ahead and read in the one I prepared earlier, GMAT 1 through 71. Bring it in. And that's our garbage mat. You'll see I just made some loose garbage mats, the shapes. Like I said, if it takes more than about 10 minutes, you're probably spending too much time getting too much detail for something like this for a tracking shot. So we'll just shuffle copy that in. Course, if you're working off your Rotopaint, you will just be bringing that down Let me just show you that in case some of you don't know. Easiest way to add it as an alpha channel is to connect your RotoPaint to the image and turn off everything except the alpha channel here in the preferences. But we have an image that we're pulling in right now, which was my finished garbage map from earlier, and we're just going to go in the shuffle copy and change the alpha to be the red channel because that's the only channel that we have coming off that GMAT image. And now we'll just confirm it's living in the alpha channel, and we're going to add a camera tracker and run a track. So I'm going to set the mask to source alpha, turn on preview features, and there we have it. It's tracking all the right things. It's avoiding the things that we don't want it to track. So we're just going to blindly click track features, and away we go. That's now complete, so we'll click solve camera. And let's take a look at the refine tab, 1.17. Let's pull these max tracks down to about 1.7, max error down to around 2.6. Try recalculating the solve. 0.6 looks good to me. I'm just going to delete rejected, delete unsolved, tab into my viewer, and actually, even though we've got a lot of spillage here, the general shape of the screen is looking sort of viewable there, so I think we're probably going to be okay. This is all about getting as close as you can, given that we don't have anything beyond this plane for tracking information. If you had some pictures on the wall here behind the screen, that would be great, but we don't. So I think we're going to be okay with that. And let's move on. So there's two ways to do this gag I'm going to show you. I'll show you the first way, which probably won't produce the best results. We may get lucky. We'll see. There are, in the Transform tab, there are two nodes, Reconcile 3D and Points to 3D. And we'll look at both of them. Right now I want you to have a look at Points to 3D. It takes a camera, so in our camera tracker, we don't care about the coordinate system for this. All we care about is aligning things in 3D space. So you don't have to worry about setting ground planes or anything. We're going to create a scene. We don't need the point cloud or the scene. We just need the camera. Let's give this a bit more room. Connect the camera to Points to 3D. Connect the image. Let's have a look at it. Points to 3D gives you, let me close my camera tracker and my camera. It gives you 4 points. Ignore point 2D because it will attempt to solve that itself in a moment. And then it's got point A, point B, or point C. The idea here is to find 3 different locations for these points, just like the modeler tool that we looked at earlier in the course. And once you've aligned those at 3 different locations, it will attempt to solve for the point. So let's do the top left corner as an example. I'll go point A at frame 1, and I'm going to click set frame. So I'm saying point A's reference is for frame 1. And now we'll go to the last frame. Actually, we'll have to go to the last frame where the corner is visible, which is 65. And we'll grab point C just to be consistent. Doesn't really matter about the order. And we'll push in, pop that in the corner, and then we'll go somewhere halfway along. And technically, it's more important to find areas where the perspective is changed significantly, but because this is a slight sort of dolly move here, it makes sense just to do halfway through the shot, and we'll put point B halfway through. So these are 3 locations. Oh, I forgot to set frame for the other. Anyway, point B set frame at frame 35, and at frame 65 here we should have set frame for point C. So we have those 3 points done, and now if we click calculate, 1 through 71, click OK. We probably won't get a good result, but who knows? And away we go. Now, you'll see that it's successfully tracked a point. Notice that it's offset, and it's kind of confusing. Why is this offset? So what it's done, just so you know, is it's worked out from those 3 different positions where that point must lie in 3D space. That's what you're seeing here. Based on the camera we fed it and those 2D points. So it's actually doing some basic projection math to figure out where everything lies. The reason that the point is offset vertically is because when we ran the tracker, Nuke incorrectly guessed the horizontal and vertical aperture. It's got the horizontal aperture right, but the vertical aperture is off. So I'm just going to say no animation here. And this is a 16 by 9 shot, so I'm going to do 22.3, which is the horizontal aperture, divided by 16 times 9. Bang. And now let's run, recalculate again. And now you should find that that point happily lives right on the corner of the screen the whole way through. Alright, a little bit of drift at the start here, but for the most part locked on. So we'd have to do some little bit of corner pin tweaking at the start. Alright, so we did that for one point. We need to do that for all 4 points. So I'm not going to cause you the grief of doing them right now, but I will pause for a moment. You can go ahead and do yours. Okay, so here I am with my 4 finished points. For some of these, because they didn't have a good spread across the timeline, I kind of had to guess one of the points. So for example here, for the lower left point, I didn't rename that right. LLP3D. In the lower left point, I simply positioned the point here where I could still see the edge and guesstimated where it would end up as its horizontal value, and likewise I kind of followed the edge. You can see a little bit of the edge here and worked out the vertical and typed those 2 values in to estimate where my point would be. Sometimes that's as good as you're going to get. But let's see how this works, see if it's any good. I'm going to add a corner pin node, and I'll simply feed these values in. So this is shift drag this upper left to, lower left to 2-1. Then lower right can go to 2-2, shift dragging. And then upper right 2-3, upper left 2-4. I'll do the copy 2s. And now in theory I have a corner pin that I can use for either match moving or stabilization, but let's just test this. So we'll add a checkerboard, and in the corner pin I'll simply set the from to the input, so it should now squish the checkerboard down to the size of our screen, merge that over our source footage, and let's see how well it does. So it's not horrible, but I imagine we're going to see a little bit of drift there on some of those frames. So let me show you another method very quickly that it's a little bit of a kludge, but I think ultimately it works a lot better. Alright, so I'm going to show you my kludge together method right now, and this is a little clumsy, but I've found this works really well in production. And I think this should actually be even easier in the version 7 of Nuke, where the new modeler tool actually includes the ability just to model points. But let me show you the workflow, and you'll see hopefully why, even though it's a little clunkier, it actually gives you better results. So I've got a modeler node here that I just added, nothing new to it. I'm just going to select, put the camera in the camera input, the source in the source input, and load it in the viewer. And we'll just pop over here, create, we'll split vertically and create a new viewer so we can look at the 3D space over here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually use triangles to define planes that I can then turn into my 4 corner track points. And I'll show you the process. So let's begin by creating a triangle that starts off. I'm at frame at 1 right now. Do the top left corner. Whoosh, there we go. Top right corner. And rather than doing the bottom right corner right now, which doesn't actually have a lot of visibility towards the end, instead I will do something else, like say the bottom left of this T-bar, and I'll pop back up there. So that's frame 1. Now frame 71, actually I gotta go to where those top are visible. Right there, frame 65 looks good. So I now realign this point to the top left, this point to the top right, and this point back to the lower left of the T-bar. And I should now have my assignments. Just want to check back at frame 1 and make sure I located that in the same place. Looking at my 3D view too to see where the surface normal's pointing here relative to camera. It's not too bad, I guess. Let's look back at frame 1. And I did choose the same general shape. So let's just scrub through, and you can see that's locked in pretty nicely. So that gives me points for my top left and my top right. The bottom left and the bottom right, it doesn't really make sense to absolutely get the corners of this, because with a corner pin setup, we can always add another corner pin. With concatenation of transforms with Nuke, there's no subpixel softening issues, and so we don't actually have to get our initial points in the corners. We can always compensate with an additional corner pin to lock everything into place. So because this lower left corner really doesn't have a lot of visibility at the front end, it's completely obscured, I'm not going to try and lock that in. Instead, I'll lock in the kink in this arrow here. So we already have a couple of handy points. I'll just make another face at frame 1. Click, click. Click on the center of that. Click to close. And I will go to frame 71, and I can still see my arrow points, the only one I need to adjust. So I'll push in here. And now I want to look. I'm going to click select F to frame all, scroll it in, and even though it's inaccurate, I'm going to make some slight adjustments just to get this all a little bit more planar. There we go. Something like that. So there's a little bit of drift there, but I'd rather have drift than overall inaccuracy. There we go. Drift we can easily compensate for with some simple keyframes in the 2D. And now we'll do the same for maybe the bottom here, right on this section, because that's visible at frame 1, and it's also visible at frame 71. So at frame 1, I'll add another try, and I'll put it just right there, the transition point of the dark and light tones in that section. Frame 71, it's this one here. So again, move that into place. It should be right here. And again, looking at my model, I see that's pushing back quite a bit. So now I'll see how I can bring that more coplanar, which means again introducing some drift. But now this thing looks much more coplanar. And actually, maybe I'll split the difference. I'll bring this up, go back to frame 1. Let's have a look. Bring it the other way. There we go. And so now, if I play this through, you'll see we have 4 points reasonably close to the 4 edges of the screen, and they should be enough to create our 4 tracking points for a corner pin. Alright, the only problem is right now they are simply vertices in 3D. So this is where the other node we talked about earlier comes into play, the reconcile 3D node. Put that over there. So what I can do now is with my reconcile 3D node, let me blow away my additional viewer right now, don't need any more. I can enter I gotta connect my camera, connect to the image, and I can now enter the 3-point data. Top left point is vertex 1, so we'll call this vert1 underscore r3d. And there's no way that I'm aware of is to copy and paste these for some bizarre reason, so we'll just enter them. Minus 0.152722, 0.111532, minus 1.11898, and now we just say create keyframes, and away it goes, basically doing the exact same thing that we had with our other node, but in this case the points tend to have a lot less drift. Why is that? It's because we've paid attention to the surface normals, and because they're defined by a plane, it allows us really to see how well they're tracking. And so I think personally I've found that I get more consistent results this way. The other benefit is I only need to find 2 frames to lock the perspective to, unlike points to 3D where we needed 3 frames to lock in each point. And so you would obviously do this for all 4 sections, apply those to a corner pin, and then add another corner pin just to do your original lineup perspective. And I found this an incredibly effective way to do screen replacements when there's lots of obstructions. So that's just my first tip, and in a second we'll go on and look at the magic of shifting the perspective of a background shot. Most common problem when dealing with a green screen composite shot that's hard to solve is perspective mismatch. The problem is frequently that the green screen talent is shot with a camera at a certain height, and the background is shot with a camera either at a different height or different distance from the background elements. So when the 2 plates are combined, the perspective looks wrong and the audience instantly understands it as fake. The problem with perspective mismatch is it's very difficult to fix in post. It's one of those things that's intrinsically built into the actual way the physics was shot, the location of the camera and what that camera could see from that vantage point. However, we can do a decent fake of perspective shift to try and realign to make the background compatible with the perspective of the foreground. And that's what I want to show you right now. It's basically very similar to what we're doing in 2D to 3D conversion work. But I'm going to show you a quick way to set this up so that you could basically realign perspective. We'll do it with a simple test shot, but the principles will apply to a larger shot. Obviously this is not a cheap effect. That's why I picked a simple scene here to make it simple for us to work with. But for in shots where the budget can allow it and you need to fix perspective, this is how you can approach it. So I've mocked up a shot in Modo that we're going to work with. Just to simplify it, like I said, just a few elements in the scene, and you'll see here that the camera is positioned fairly low to the ground. And what we want to do is see how could we actually get the background to look as if it had been shot from a camera a little higher. So what we're going to do is we're actually not going to use Modo. We're not going to model in Modo. I'm going to show you some very primitive but effective ways to model inside a nuke to solve the problem. Let's get started. Go ahead and read in from the camera repo directory, camerarepo.axr. And this is a little render, and obviously I forgot to change the color space to linear before I rendered out. So I'll just change color space to sRGB here in Nuke. And this is our shot. So we want it to look as if the camera is bearing down from a higher position than what it is right now. So what we're going to do is create 3D objects for this, so that then if we projection map this on, we can then look from a different vantage point. First thing we're going to do is set up the ground plane, and if we look around in here, there we go, I can see where the back wall is of the shot. And what I'm going to do is create a depth map, and I'm simply going to do that by adding a rotor shape, setting it up like this. Alright, and then I'm going to command drag or control drag on a PC to create a gradient. First of all, I should go to my settings and make sure I match the HD format here. And if you look, there's my depth map. It's solid at the back wall and gets dark as we move towards the front. So how do we use it? Well, I'm going to add a camera. I'm just going to leave it as generic camera. Ideally, if we knew the focal length and aperture of the camera we were shooting the actual footage with, we could feed them in here. But we're just going to leave this agnostic for now and kind of guesstimate. And now I'm going to add a card to stick my background on. Feed this into a scene. Feed the camera in. And then after the card, add a displaced geo. And feed the rotor paint into my displaced geo displacement. Displaced geo, if you're not familiar, just pushes the geometry out based on a grayscale gradient, which is what we want. So now if I go into 3D, hit the F key to fit, frame all, that's all set up. Let's disable the displaced geo first. What we want to do is set up our card to match the camera. So focal length, I'm just going to command drag in case we change that later, down to lens in focal length, and horizontal aperture, command drag down to lens in H aperture, like so. And so now in my card, if I drag out in Z, it'll fit the camera frustum. Well, actually it won't, because we haven't set up our camera correctly. Horizontal aperture, we want to copy that, paste, divided by 16 times 9 to get a 16 by 9 horizontal vertical backing. And now we'll see that it fits the frustum no matter where we position it. So I'm just going to position it back to 10. I'm just being fairly arbitrary. Now I'll re-enable the displacement map. And as a scale, you see it's pushing forward in the wrong direction right now. So with my rotor paint, I'm just going to add an invert node straight after it to flip the colors. And now it's going to scale the bottom forward to give us our ground plane. And I will go ahead and just crank up that scale value. And you'll notice that something's happening. Yes, it's scaling, but it's moving outside of the camera frustum. And that's not actually what we want. What we want is for it to shrink as it moves forward. And there's all kinds of clever ways to align this, but with the displaced geo, easiest way to do this is to add a trilinear, which basically will mess everything up at first, but now we can go reset shape to input, and it will set it back and creates a little bounding squishy box around our image. Now, there's some basic math to just some expression links you can do to make it all line up, but for now, what we're just going to do is look at the top down view and just manually move our points in one at a time so that they line up with the camera frustum position. There we go. And now we'll go to the right side and pull down the points for the top. Okay, so now if we go back to regular 3D view, we'll find that our ground plane shrinks as it comes forward. Now there's a kink to it, and first of all, you'll see we don't have enough tessellation, so go to the card and we'll up the columns and rows until we get enough detail. Just do 32 by 32. For a ground plane, that should be enough. You'll see that this thing curves, and that's actually because of the mapping of light entering the frustum and going through. There's some trig that I unfortunately can't get into right now, that we could write an expression that would make this go perfectly flat. But unfortunately that forms part of a patent that is used in some conversion technology that I implemented for a company. So I can't share that in fully, but I can do a quick tweak. And we'll just rough this in by throwing on a grade node after our roto, like so, and just adjusting the gamma, which will at least smooth out the kink, even though it won't perfectly remove it. You'll see it gives us more of an S-bend. You could also use a color lookup to dial it in, but we'll live with a little bit of unevenness in our floor for this. It's not as critical as it would be if we were working on a stereoscopic conversion, because we're just trying to do a general tweak to the background plane. So everything, if we throw in a scanline renderer here, it should look identical still to the original shot, pretty much. But we now have our ground plane mapped to something. All right, let's deal with the box at the back. So we'll create, let me just organize this a little bit. Throw a backdrop on node on here. That's our first section. So we'll do this whole process again. And in fact, we'll keep this out. We'll add another card. And for this card, I'm going to do some quick and careless roto to isolate it. Point here, point here. And some depth of field to worry about there, but let's just do this. That'll do. Like so. Dial this in. Alright, close enough for demonstration purposes. And we'll just shuffle copy that in here and pre-molt it. Feed that into our card like so. And did we copy and paste the card? I didn't. I just created a new one. So I need to grab my camera values again and command drag them to match. And now I can move the Z position of this. And what I will do, at least for now, is I'll have it sit so it lines up with the ground contact of the front of the box on the ground plane. So there's my ground plane. And I'll just dial it in so it lines up with the front edge. We'll fix this in a moment. Now we need a depth mat for this box as well. right? So that this thing can actually have some dimensionality. So we'll just add another rotor paint, and I'm going to create a shape, but here's what I'm going to do. So I'll just create something for the corner here. Realign it a little bit. And that should do. And again, I'm going to use gradients. And I'll command drag out. And you'll see what's forming here. Something like this. Let's have a look at the card again. So that the furthest distance is the point at the back. And then we actually want to figure out where those sidelines would end up to line up with the perspective of the background. Like that. The front doesn't matter so much because nothing's happening there with the box. So let's see how that looks. If we throw in another displaced geo node, and we'll pop this here. This is the displacement. We'll ignore the trilinear thing for now. Drop this in, and let's take a look at our 3D view. So I've got, just to recap, I've got my footage being pre-multiplied by a mat that cuts out the box, another mat generating the depth mat. This is so the box is projected onto a card. The card then passes through a displaced geo, which is displaced by this depth mat we just created. And let's see how this works. First of all, we need to subdivide the card significantly. Normally, again, what I would do is I would crop the layer so that the lattice actually just covers the box area, but that's a little bit more math again, just to make that all work properly. So we're just going to be gratuitous and assume you have lots of RAM, and just subdivide the whole mesh, not just the bit that has the image of the box on it. And in the displaced geo, we'll just start pushing the value up, and as we do, you see our box begins to emerge. So we'll make it a nice square box like so. And you can see it, and then we'll have to reshuffle it to sit against its floor contact. Somewhere about there. All right. So we now have that piece. And we can continue to do that for the other 3 items on the table, and I'll do that, but then I'll take a break so that we don't waste too much time with the gory details. Alright, here we have our finished set of shapes. Let's pull off the ground plane for now so you can see them all there happily living, and you'll see the different groups. I haven't labeled them, but you can quickly see which is which. If we tab back, you'll see that's the box. This is the kettle. This is its shape. This is the canister, its depth shape, and this is the pot to the right and its depth mat. So these are all feeding in and creating our basic shapes. Alright, now the one thing we do need to do is do a bit of clone painting to remove, or clean plating somehow, to remove this, depending on how much perspective shift. But if we're looking for a radical perspective shift, unfortunately we're going to have to do quite a bit of cleaning. And because this is just a still, I'll quickly throw on this, and we'll do just a quick and dirty for the sake of the demo. Just paint out this teapot. And with the magic of time lapse, you'll see, I know I've done a hard, purist among you, I am aware that this is a horrible shadow mismatch, but we're just doing a quick and dirty clean plate here to demonstrate the concept. So now I have a box that hopefully we can go quite a bit higher than the original camera angle and not see down below it. And we'll need to also clean plate the ground on the ground plane of everything else, which is a little problematic given that we have all these reflections in the surface. But that's life. Let me just quickly do that. I'll branch off another paint node here and clone out the edges of everything. Oh, not looking at it in the viewer, which should be why it's not working. Pause. Alright, like I said, don't get hung up on my bad paint job, but that should hopefully do it. I'll feed that to my ground plane. There's my ground plane now. To close everything else. Then we'll render that out separately and comp everything on. So I'll create a scan line for that, connect it to the camera. That's our render of our clean plated background plane. And then everything else can render out with the other scanline renderer. Let's look at our scene. These are all our scene elements. They can feed in here. And that'll be the render for those. And obviously we'll need to do some anti-aliasing on the mats. And we can also adjust the anti-aliasing setting up here. But if we merge these together, we'll see the beginnings of what we're looking for. However, notice that the pot has gone way off here compared with the original shot up here. Okay, what's happening is we haven't applied a trilinear to our various items. We applied it here to our main backdrop, but not to the other elements. So I'm just going to copy and paste that. Let's take a look. There we go. Close this all out. Double click our scene. There's our box. Now the trilinear, I have to reset shape to input. And again, I have to do my trick with the trilinear by going to the side, adjusting its points. And I won't bore you with the details because you've already seen this. Alright, so that's now complete. And you can see if we switch back here, that we now successfully have pretty much, obviously the renderer looks better when we're zoomed in, but we pretty much have the same thing as start. Now you can see my bad clean plating job coming in there all the way through, but conceptually we have a match. But now what we can do, and this is the magic trick that we've been waiting for all along, all the hard work pay off. In this camera here, I can now say, let's pop it up by 0.1. So I'm going to move the camera up by 0.1. I can start to see more of my holes where my clean plate's gone bad. And then I'll rotate down by 2 degrees in X just to reposition. maybe -4 to get it nicely centered. Of course, that really starts to show my bad clean plating job, but that's okay. And that's it. We have now adjusted accurately the perspective of the shot. Let's have a look. This is the after, and this is before. So you see we've actually moved the camera up, rotated it back down, and everything has actually correctly realigned in the shot. Now, we've taken a lot of shortcuts. My roto was lazy, the clean plating is not great. In fact, there's a few other things we would want to address if we were going to be strictly accurate. The shadow should stretch a little, the reflection should stretch a little bit. There's a bunch of things that would need to take place to correctly complete the shot. But hopefully it's given you an idea of the workflow if this came up. So this is not a cheap process, as I mentioned in the beginning, but if the budget allows, it's certainly possible to correct a shot. If there's a more intricate model, we can do a 3D match to it and generate a depth mat out of a Modo or another 3D application like Maya and work things that way. But it's amazing how far you can get with these cheap, dirty, roto-shaped depth mats that we created that allow us to convincingly stretch things like that box at the back. So we're actually seeing more of the lid than we did before. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a nice way to adjust perspective. That's it for the course. Bug me on the forums if there are any specific things that you didn't grasp during the course. Happy to do a bit of post-mortem and cover off some of those other things in the forums. Thanks a lot for listening, guys.